Welcome, everyone. I am very happy to welcome those who are on Zoom with us and those who are live on Facebook. This is part 2 of a critique of symbols of Jamaican nationhood. In fact, we are discussing today the people's symbols. We are here in this summer series of engagements on critical issues of culture, history. This is part 2 and the role of the university. Friends and colleagues, I began our session 2 weeks ago with lyrics from Egyptian. These are some serious times. But today, I will continue to sing redemption songs and share in honor of His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Haile Selassie, on his 128th Earth Day. Today, I will share words from Buju Banton. Hills and valleys, only Rasta can liberate the people. Don't let them fool you. Many live this life without having a clue. No moment to reflect on the cycles of life. Let them know we want go home our yard. Fittingly, therefore, we are examining the people's symbols, and His Imperial Majesty is one of the important symbols for many in Jamaica and beyond, even those who don't declare themselves to be Rastas. The ICS, as a teaching and research institution, honors the legacy of His Imperial Majesty through the offering of courses, research, and advocacy around Rastafari studies, for which there is also a minor. So for those of you who have an interest in pursuing higher education, we are definitely able to satisfy your needs through our cultural studies and applied cultural studies program. And yes, we are teaching Rastafari studies at the University of the West Indies. Our exercise as an ethical university is about liberation. And so today, we bring you a critical engagement of symbols of Jamaican nationhood, the people's symbols, with a lineup of 6 fantastic speakers who are grounded in the observation, study, and documentation of people's symbols. Before our speakers, though, I express gratitude again. This event is a partnership. I want to thank the National Council on Reparation and the Center for Reparations Research for both engaging with the Institute of Caribbean Studies and also for their continued support in maintaining attention around key issues in relation to our daily life in a post-colonial world. I am Sonia Stanley Naya, Director of the Institute of Caribbean Studies and the Reggae Studies Unit, and I'm your moderator today. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Bert Samuels. He's going to be speaking to us about the role of British laws in the oppression of African Jamaicans. Bert is a Pan-Africanist attorney and co-chair of the National Council on Reparation. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule, Mr. Samuels. Over to you.
Greetings to all. Yes, am I being heard?
We're hearing you loud and clear, Bert.
And it's great to be with this gathering of friends and like-minded persons. I know I have 15 minutes, so I'd like to go straight to it. Many people may not know, but during our enslavement as a people, there was a case which came up in 1772 called the Somerset case in England, where an enslaved African was on a ship in the British harbor, and an application was made to free him, release him, and the Somerset case decided that enslavement could not take place on British soil in England. So one of the weird things was that this was 1772, you will find that in Jamaica, slavery was legal and it was part of the British Empire. So you could be an enslaved person in one part of the British Empire, but you could be also a person who could not be enslaved on British soil. So the contradictions continued. And that moved now for us to understand the institutions which came out of our enslavement. And I'm rushing and I'm deciding to deal with UII firstly. As you know, the UII, no student can get their rights before last year unless the visitor in the form of the Queen of England was the person to whom students should appeal for justice on the UII campus, the center of learning in the Caribbean. And therefore, that's one of the symbols of the Queen of England dictating the lives of students in the highest institution of learning. And therefore, that is one of the symbols which was just changed, last year by causing it to come home to the West Indies, that particular visitor. So I went to court for Dr. Myrie, who was contesting an exam which he was not allowed to sit. And when I went before the court to get justice under the Jamaican Constitution, the lawyers for the UWI at the time argued that he could not come to the courts of Jamaica. He had to go to the Queen of England as a visitor. So that's one of the institutions which were just managed to have changed. Now, I want to go to other areas of law, how we have been, as it were, imprisoned by British law. And one of the things that you find is that before 1975, all children born out of wedlock were deemed to be bastards. And how did that play out? So that the majority of Jamaican children under the British colonial laws could not inherit their father's property if he left no will. Now, the majority of Jamaicans don't leave a will. So that if a man had children with his wife, but had children out of wedlock elsewhere, the children with his wife could inherit property if he left no will, because the law protected those children. But as it were, the children born out of wedlock. So what that meant is that the majority of Jamaican children before 1975, one could not have their father's name registered on their certificate of birth, and they could not inherit where their father left no property for them. And that has caused, as it were, the discrimination of the majority of African Jamaican people under British law. Not until 1974, the Status of Children Act, as it were, outlawed the bastardy law. There's an act which was passed in 1926, which is called the bastardy law. Now, if you go to England and call that person a bastard, that is a profanity. It is a bad word, as it were. But so that the majority of African Jamaican children were deemed to be bastards before 1974. Now we go to family law. One of the things about being educated under British law is that we begin to feel that when Africans came to Jamaica, we brought no laws because we were so uncivilized. We did not bring laws here. Now, what we have to understand that within the African context, the family land cannot be disposed of. So that under British law, a man can decide to give his sweetheart all of his estate and leave his children and his wife and his children landless. Under African law, family land cannot be disposed of outside of the family. And that is why landlessness has caused so much hurt to our people. And to add to that, after 1838, crown lands belonging to the British, stolen from the Spanish, who stole it from the Tainos, was now vested in the Crown of England. We still maintain a crown land principle in Jamaica, which no one can go on and settle and claim. You can go on a private land and settle on it for 12 years and claim it. You can't go on to crown lands because this belongs to the British Empire. So we are now seeing that landlessness is something that was dictated by British law. And that's another area of law which has caused hurt to African Jamaicans. Now, because of the celebration of His Imperial Majesty, I want to go to the treatment of Rastafari under British law and under colonial law. The first thing is that Rastafarians were never accepted as a religion. You can't be marriage officers and you can't carry out the rights of other religions. So it was inherently discriminated against. But I recall in 2003, that when Rastafari was to be imprisoned, as you enter the general penitentiary or the Spanish town prisons, you were trimmed. You had to be trimmed. There wasn't a single lock-bearing African Jamaican in Jamaican prisons before 2003. I had the privilege of going to court and have that reversed. But what happened is that outside of the prisons, African Jamaican children could not wear locks to school. And maybe we think that that struggle is over. It is not over, because right now at the Kensington Primary, Kensington School, you have a situation where a locked child has been shut out, and we had to go to court. Isaac Buchanan had to go to court to get the child restored in the school. So in 2020, in a public institution, persons with locks are being kept out of getting an education. Then we have the Coral Gardens, which assault upon Rastafari, which was legitimately done by decree of the head of state. So that Rastafari is still being persecuted under the colonial laws, and in terms of banks and institutions, you can't get employment. And one of the things that the Charter of Rights has now instituted is that you have what is called horizontal rights. In other words, it is not just the state that has an obligation to guarantee your rights, but private schools, these prep schools that do not allow locked children in their schools, are also in breach of the Constitution and the Charter of Rights since 2011, because you now have rights that you can enjoy not between the state and yourself, but also the state and private institutions. So that is something that we must look at in terms of our colonial laws. Now we go to the question of how we protect those laws in the courts. And when we look to see that a person has to have money to be able to approach the court and pay a lawyer to establish their rights, that is another aspect, that there is no state assistance for you to pursue your rights. If you are sick, at least you can go to a clinic and you get some assistance. Under the British law, the whole question of preserving your fundamental rights, you have to pay for that out of your pockets. So that we find that the poorer persons in Jamaica have not been able to settle those rights. We have also the question of the Privy Council, which is a colonial institution which happens to be in the highest courts of Jamaica. For example, if we are going to pursue reparation, how can we go to the highest court, which is a British court, to seek within that framework our freedom, our compensation? And the Queen of England is the head of the Privy Council. So we cannot see, as it were, a British court headed by the Queen of England ruling against her. We have institutions like Queen's Counsel in Jamaica, where you take an oath that you will always serve and you will not take fees from the Queen of England, and you will do no matters against her. So embedded in us, although we think we are independent, our Constitution still has at the head of the three arms of government, the courts, the executive, and the parliament, the Queen of England still being over us. So that knee that is imposed on our necks by the colonial, ex-colonial masters still continues to burden us in the legal system. And I therefore think that we should not be thinking that we are as liberated as we think we are, because we are still under those vestiges of the colonial system. Laws have to be revisited. British trained lawyers do not think outside of the box. We do not think that there were laws which existed in Western Africa, where we're taken from, which protect family. For example, under West African law, you don't have the concept of first cousins. First cousins are virtually brothers and sisters. And within the family group, the older sibling must account to the younger sibling for the treatment of children. The question of the child belongs to the village has now been tried to be reinstituted, which is an African principle, that the village is the one that grows the children. Now I see that we are trying to bring a law that if your neighbor is abusing your child, then you can intervene. That was always African. That was always the village in which we operated. So because we disrespect our own self and we have self-hate, we think that we didn't bring any good laws from Africa to Jamaica, and none of our laws. And finally, on the question of obia, which is a religious practice, we have a system where under the Jamaican law, before flogging was abolished about 15 years ago, when you are caught practicing obia, you were whipped and imprisoned. It's one of the few things where you suffered to be whipped. Moderator, what my timing? Am I going 50?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so under the obia laws, what we have in Jamaica is that it's one of the few offenses that you are whipped and sentenced, and you can get as much as a year for practicing obia. But also the person who goes to the obia man can be imprisoned for 6 months. And that person is also whipped and imprisoned. And also, it is one of the first laws in Jamaica where after you've served your sentence, you come out under police supervision. So a man who has been sentenced, does time, got whipped, and comes out of prison, the law allows the judge to pass a police supervision on you. Now, I have always said, we have been taught that obeah is one of the most dangerous things. And look at it, people think that obeah is worse than enslavement. I've always said, obeah me, but don't enslave me. People actually under the Western interpretation of Christianity feel that obeah is worse than slavery. So the white colonialists and or enslavers taught us that when they enslaved us, it was quite good. What the worst thing could happen to us is that we are practicing obeah. And that is why we have pushed Haiti in a certain direction because of the practice of voodoo. And we feel that is the worst place to be. So that re-education about obeah and things like that, I think that it's time that we remove that law totally from the books so that we can liberate our people and people can understand that it comes out of African medicine and African spiritual beliefs. And it is not what the colonial people did to us. If they thought obeah was so dangerous, they would not seek to imprison us because they would be afraid of us. It is because they don't like the fact that we had something to look to other than the religion they brought to us. So that is my last talk. My last talk is enslave me. Don't enslave me. I prefer you obeah me.
Thank you so much, Bert. You know, you have put into perspective landlessness, citizenship, claims to crown land and family, the treatment of rastas, the cutting of locks, non-entry to lock children in public institutions, access to education, and even our own religious practice. There are laws that have discriminated against Jamaicans and continue to do so. The courts, the executive and parliament, the colonial knee, you're telling us, is still on our necks. Some of us do know this, burdening our people in post-colonial Jamaica, where the queen essentially remains one of the people's symbols. And that's what we're trying to remove. We can't continue to have the queen remain one of the people's symbols, not when there has been so much oppression. So I want to thank you for your contribution, laying the perspective for us in the way that you have. Colleagues, our next speaker is Dr. Anna Ford Smith. The title of our presentation, Policing Memory, Policing the Nation, the case of Kingston's disappeared street murals. But let me say a little bit about Dr. Anna Ford Smith. She's a scholar, a theater worker, and poet. She was educated in Jamaica at St. Andrew High School, and after studying theater, began teaching at Edna Manley College for the Visual and Performing Arts, grounded in the arts. She researched, edited, and contributed in her adult years to Sistrin's book, Lionheart Gal, Life Stories of Jamaican Women, published in 1986. She has a collection of poems, a number of published works. Among her many theater projects have been the collectively created Fallen Angel and The Devil Concubine, a dramatic adaptation of My Mother's Last Dance, and Just Jazz, an adaptation of Jean Reese's Let Them Call It Jazz. Her most recent publication is Three Jamaican Plays, a post-colonial anthology, year 2010. And she is an associate professor in the Community Arts Practice Program under the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University in Toronto. Anna, my friend and colleague, happy to have you.
As I'm speaking to you from Toronto, I thought I would update you on some of the struggles around national symbols which are taking place here. Last weekend, Black Lives Matter organized a peaceful protest downtown in Toronto, and in an artistic intervention, splashed pink paint on 3 or 4 statues. Edgerton Ryerson, who was the architect of Ryerson University, is named after him, as you would know. He was the architect of the residential school system and also a slave owner. And he also founded Ryerson University. So he was number 1. Number 2 was John A. Macdonald, who is sort of the grandfather of the Canadian nation of Confederation. He, interestingly enough, had a a Jamaican connection in that his father-in-law was a major slave owner in Jamaica. And so, he was connected through his wife to enslavement in Jamaica. And the third one was Edward VII, which was a statue which was brought from India to Canada because the Indians didn't want it anymore because Edward VII had presided over particularly brutal repression, so ended up in Canada. As a result, were arrested and imprisoned and denied access to legal counsel for many hours. They were released and are out on bail now, but will be facing charges in the future. So they'll be facing charges around September 30th. One of the people who has been arrested is certainly known to Blacker. It's Daniel Smith, who he might remember, who he probably remembers. And so I wanted to share that because she's of Caribbean descent. She's Barbadian and Jamaican origin. And so as I begin to speak about memorialization and national memory in Jamaica, I wanted to make the connection between the colonial process of memorialization here and show the links, the transnational links that exist between North America and the colonial systems of memorialization that have been established all over the globe. Now, having said that, I want to turn to my work on murals. And just to put it in context, to begin by saying that all our national symbols are, in a sense, rooted in memorialization practices. Most national symbols work both as an impetus for action and an impetus for grief and memory. It is by turning our gaze to the horrors of the past that we find the courage and the strength to move forward. So in remembering Morant Bay, for example, we tell a story of the past which allows us to recreate collective bonds in the present. In societies like ours, which have been founded on genocide and enslavement, memory and mourning carry a particular importance because it is one of the few sites where in the long period of enslavement, people could express a form of knowledge based in memory that was excluded from dominant narratives. So things like dead yards, rites like wakes, like kumina, and so on, became very important sites of national identity, very important spaces of cultural memory, which were both sacred, but also were subject-forming spaces in which people could begin to assert agencies. But in recent times, where emancipatory narratives have been set back and discredited, memory becomes, in a sense, a repository for thinking about unfulfilled claims and subjugated identities. So thinking about what we want to remember, as well as thinking about what we are not allowed to remember, enable us to think through forms of justice in the present. And where, as in the recent past, there is a sort of upsurge in forms of violence, often mourning practices become somehow insufficient. Conventional mourning practices become somehow insufficient to express the accumulation of pain that people feel. And so new forms of mourning have to be invented. And I would argue that in Jamaica, the sort of the inauguration of neoliberalism and the new forms of imperialism, which have arrived and been instituted on the back of old forms of colonial knowledge that have never sort of been fully eroded, that these forms of neoliberalism were installed through a whole new wave of violence. And many people have written about the violent ways in which the neoliberal order has been installed in Jamaica. Many people have spoken about the retreat of the state, the reformation of the state as a kind of traffic cop for transnational capital. We saw this performed very recently when, the doors opened to tourism again in the height of the COVID pandemic because of the pressure of corporations to open the door so that tourism could be rekindled. So when this kind of violence happens, communities try to find ways to create their own forms of memory and to find ways to create new ways of thinking about who they regard as heroes and who they want to remember. So what I wanted to show you were some of the kind of images and aspirations that people express through the murals, which have existed in communities. Now, the pictures that I was going to show you no longer exist. They've been painted out. They were painted out after Dudus. They started to paint them out just before, but they painted them out over the period of 2010 into 2013. And now most of the murals, which I was going to show you, have been destroyed. The memories essentially talk back to the dominant narrative of the criminal, which exists as a kind of ubiquitous figure in dominant narratives of the Jamaican state, I would argue. So we read about the criminal in the newspaper, and as we walk around, we hear, we can pick up fragments of conversation in which we hear people speaking about a figure which is called who is roughly glossed as a criminal. And the criminal is actually a shorthand for a kind of stereotype, a kind of old colonial stereotype in which people who live in particular spaces are seen as people who are amoral and lawless and who should be punished for what has taken place over the last 40 years. Prior to this, Jamaica is imagined as a somewhat peaceful society, idyllic in many ways, and the word criminal becomes shorthand for the representation of a racialized and objectified category of beings who are discussed as if they have specific reductive characteristics that somehow erode their humanity. They come from particular spaces. They're from the ghetto. They are very geographically near to middle class sections of Kingston, but are nonetheless as far away from those sections as you can imagine socially. They must be avoided by the respectable and the better off, because those who live there, those who live in the ghetto, come from down there, a kind of terminology that recalls Victorian metaphors for the genitals. Space in this formulation becomes race, because those who are born in that geography are never phenotypically white, even though it is an open secret that many wealthy white and near white Jamaicans have made their money illegally. The criminal is nonetheless depicted as unlike them because he is phenotypically black, with little access to formal systems of cultural authorization and forms of cultural capital that whiten or confer class respectability. And this might include mastery of English, higher education, and ownership of things. So the takeaway point from this is the fact that being born in a particular space automatically endows you with a predisposition toward criminality, which is racialized, and therefore to disposability, because the criminal needs to be controlled, disciplined, violently if necessary, and increasingly exterminated. So, I can go into a long discussion of where the origins of this narrative comes from, because this is a very old colonial narrative, which we can trace right back to slavery. And the fact that it is still alive in a way is a testament to the fact that colonial education has not disappeared. The murals which exist in a way talk back to this and create a counter narrative. These murals are in particular communities, and they are largely of men, although there are some which are of women. There are several types of murals. One type celebrates community heroes. You would know those from, you can often see those on main roads. So you would see images of pop icons like Bob Marley, but particular icons that come from particular community. For example, Marcia Griffith, who comes from Hannahtown. You can see Usain Bolt, you can see figures who have achieved fame, but you can also see community heroes who have somehow achieved particular things, such as completing university or serving the community in some way. The ones which are the most controversial, and I'll skip to those right away, are the murals of the Dons, the Don murals, and these are the ones that have been painted out. And these also represent community heroes in an ambivalent way, often ambivalent way. So in some cases, the Don murals present figures as godlike, as assuming kind of godlike proportions. And here I'm thinking of a mural of a guy called Zico, who was shot over about 10 years ago. And this mural has him standing with a dove on his shoulder. And behind him is an aura, a kind of religious aura, such as what you would see in a church, where you would see a saint with an aura behind him, a blue aura. So here he is deified. And beside him is a psalm which says, "Please my cause, O Lord, with those who strive with me, fight against those who fight against me." And this would be a kind of an appeal to a sacred order of justice, which is able to transcend the materiality, which brought about the end of his life. So in a sense, this mural is expressing an aspiration for the recognition of goodness. A second important element is the desire for respectability. So you would see often murals which demonstrate youth graduating from high school, wearing a graduation gown and a hat, carrying a scroll. And in a sense, this would echo sort of the Garveyite image. You will remember the image of Garvey in which he appears wearing his gown and in full regalia as a scholar. These murals pick up on that image and kind of reproduce them. Then you have a sportsy theme, a theme in which, a lot of the guys are represented as chilling out, but chilling out in a way with the paraphernalia of the American sports canon. So Michael Jordan kind of look in the past, but you might also see them, with a bottle of Red Stripe beer, as in the case of Dada, and with a spliff, and against the background of the community. So you would see the background of the community sort of being marked by the presence of the figure. A final point I want to make about some of the murals is that they have a kind of transnational element, in that in one of them, there's Murphy, aka Papa Smurf, and he's shown kind of elevated in all in white, which, as you know, has spiritual connotations. All in white, but sportsy again with running shoes, and he's elevated above above skyscrapers, and the skyscraper give you the sense of his being in New York. You can see him looking down on the American empire. And on either side, gangster for life, forever love, forever miss. He's an example of, this is an example of a way in which he's seen as being both local and global, as extending his presence beyond the island of Jamaica, rooted in the island of Jamaica, but from Jamaica to the world. So you begin to see transnational connections there, both in terms of content, but also in and later on in other murals by other artists in terms of their connection to the graffiti culture of New York. So a guy like Cleaver Cunningham paints very much in the style of the American graffiti artists. So you see this dialogue taking place between the African-American diaspora and Jamaican inner city. I want to end with my last example, which is the example of Jason Smith, who was murdered a long time ago now, and whose mother painted a mural, a beautiful mural of him out. Well, she didn't paint it. Howie painted it, the artist named Howie, who is from Spanish Town and who works a lot in De La Vega City, and who does a lot of work with dance hall, with murals in studios and so on. Jason's murals were painted on the wall, but also on the car of his mother. So he was shot by the police when he was 15 and was found only to be carrying a bag of chips and a bottle of water. And it doesn't seem to have been a targeted killing. It seems to have been an accident. But you can't bring him back. He's dead. So his mother carried out a campaign for redress, and part of her campaign included a visual expose of police brutality, and commemorating her son through these images, which called out police brutality. And she also had this painted on her car, and she drove around Kingston with images of her son on the car. These murals were all painted out. Some of them are Dawn murals, but not all of them are Dawn murals. They were all painted out in an effort to remark the space by the police. They painted out police blue. So all of this ephemera and this work, which attempted to express these aspirations within the community, were destroyed, obliterated, and in a sense, the killing of the person who had already been killed once was performed once more. When the police killed the figure that was represented in the mural. A lot more to say about that, but the point I want to leave with you is a question, and it is: how and why do we allow colonial narratives to still so determine the culture of our memorialization, that when popular murals and vernacular murals are produced and supported by the community, we feel that it is the right of our police force to destroy these small acts of resistance? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honor. You know, as you put for us the symbols and practices of memorializing among the people into perspective, particularly murals, I'm really and truly noting the ways in which the presentation before on the laws that don't serve us get echoed by your own presentation. That laws like the vagrancy laws, the OBE law, there are so many ways in which we begin to stereotype the community heroes, the mainly Black people of the folk, and branding them, profiling them as disposable, as criminal. The vagrancy laws are notorious. They are open-ended. The ways in which the police force can, in fact, use these mechanisms, apparatuses of the state, to further oppress the people. So I want to thank you for your presentation, because I think it follows quite nicely from the first one. I want to turn our attention now to Mr. Owen Blacker Ellis. Everybody knows Blacker. Blacker is going to talk to us about inner city trials and triumphs, some of the untold stories and unseen symbols. But let me say a little bit about Blacker. He's a writer, educator, performing artist, well known over the last 3 decades for work as a comedic entertainer. He has worked all over the world as actor, musician, motivational speaker, workshop facilitator, and much more. He is a father. He has written scripts for stage, screen, television, published books of poetry. In fact, I was privileged to have introduced one of Blacker's poetry launches. So we go back a long way. He's currently, of course, a senior lecturer in the School of Arts Management and Humanities at the Enumadic College of the Visual and Performing Arts, and an adjunct lecturer at Trenchtown Polytechnic College. We're happy to have you. You are also setting your eyes wide on the Ph.D. in Cultural Studies at the University of the West Indies in the Institute of Caribbean Studies. Over to you, Blacker.
All right, greetings. I'm very happy that Anna and Mr. Bert Samuel came before me, because they really dovetail nicely into what I want to talk about. The whole idea of land and landlessness and the murals on the walls of inner city, quite nicely into what I want to say. So, here's what I'm gonna 15 minutes and I have to tell so many stories that I'm not gonna actually cover most of them. I'm gonna go straight into it. Donga Yard is a living museum. Yeah, Donga Yard is a living museum. The ghettos or garrison or inner city or whatever definition you choose to reference the working class or suffering mass communities of Kingston and urban St. Andrew, or even urban Montego, the urban St. James, are places that are really alive with untold stories. Untold stories that, among other things, speak to a kind of microcosm of Jamaica, a kind of an essential encapsulation of significant aspects of our country's personality, a kind of not so recognized symbol of our national character, you know, as a kind of a good, but bad, little but talawa space. So I'm very interested in how the urban community, what we call ghetto or inner city, how they symbolize the Jamaican personality of case study in contradiction on one hand, and exemplar of binary bound division on the other hand. What I mean by that? Just like people speak of Jamaica, we can speak of the ghettos in that they somehow punch above their weight. They excel with limited resources, people there. We see evidence of genius and creativity and rich history, but poor people. That's the way the world very often sees Jamaica, and we see ourselves. And that's very much the way how we see inner city community, or at least the way we from the ghetto see ourselves. And so that's the whole idea of the case study in contradiction. Why is a place that is so rich with potential so poor? Why is a place like Trenchtown that has given Jamaica so many legends and has, you know, this attraction to the world? Why is it still referred to and seen as one of the poorest and the most violent prone places in Kingston? So that's the case study in contradiction that is Jamaica, that is symbolized in the stories of the inner city. And then there's the binary bound division where you're either this or you're that. And that is Jamaica, and that is very clearly and starkly exemplified in the inner cities. I mean, every garrison is either PMP or GLP, and everybody there is either Gaza or Gully, or Dagat or Chicken Head, or Thugs or Friars, and there's this constant division across poles, you know. And so I'm very interested in that. I'm very interested in the untold stories. If we look at how cultural theorist Clifford Geertz riffs on culture as the web of stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, then my question is, who gets to tell our stories? Who gets to narrate the inner city stories? And so I'm very interested in how the inner city people are represented, both in terms of how they are represented, as in shown to us over and over, but also in terms of how they are represented, both in terms of how they're represented in the local House of Parliament and in the global space of entertainment. Who gets to stand in our space as ghetto people? Who gets to represent us in Parliament? And very often, people who get that opportunity are invariably not of the inner city. So it's time we tell our stories. And there are so many untold stories. Now I speak of inner city largely and broadly, but I really want to zero in on my place, Trenchtown, because that's where I come from, right? So, and I remember to tell a quick, well, refer to a story, because I won't tell the stories, I just reference the stories, because the time to tell the stories is not right now. I want to talk about the stories and reference them. So there's a Rasta man who was called Ras Diley, Anthony Bartholomew Diley, who in the early 70s, they lived in a space where the only thing they bought from the shop was matches. They grew all their food. They went to catch water in a spring way over in New Haven behind Duane Park, and everything that they ate, they grew themselves. They only buy matches from shop. I remember as a teenager arguing with the Rasta man about his doctrines and beliefs and so on. I remember him saying to me that the symbols of our two oppositional parties really symbolize how them deal with us. And he said the V sign is two finger as Jokoteyai, and the clenched fist is a fist we are thumping down. And that is how we saw those symbols of the political parties. That's how we read them. So those were the unread that he was reading to me. Those symbols of Jokoteyai and punch it down. Or in other words, two of them whole way. And I found it very interesting. But he also said to me that the alphabet as we know it wrong, because it have A, B, C, then D, E, F, G, H, and I. And that can't be right, because I come first. And everything happens because I see things, so therefore it should be I see A, B, D, and the rest. And at first, then I thought, sure, dial about too much media. But as I grew older, I realized that, hey, here's something, because it's the importance of the individual, the importance of the person, and personal agency, and everything, because we see that's where I want to come back now to the personal. So I'm going to tell a story about my Trenchtown, right? So there was a time when there was no Rima and jungle, there was just one Trenchtown. You could walk up West Road with your back to Panishtown Road, Maypen Cemetery, and your face to the hills, and walk up West Road, crossing 14 streets, 1st Street to 14th Street. And you could turn out the roundabout there and go back down Collie Smith Drive, which runs parallel to West Road, with your back to the mountain and your face to Maypen Cemetery, and you see beyond it, and you pass those 14 streets, right? And that was for me like that, a very simple geography of my community. And I remember early mornings in like 72, when I just passed common entrance and going to high school outside to Trenchtown, I would pass down West Road and see two brown-skinned Rastaman jogging around the Vin Lawrence Park field in the early pre-dawn. And the picture then meant nothing to me then as a youth. But now it is a rich memory, because those two joggers were Bob Marley and Alan Phil Cole. And that was my community. And if we look on the idea that in 74, Bob Marley in the song Natty Dread say, I walk up to 1st Street and then I walk up to 2nd Street to see, then I try down to 3rd Street, and he stopped. The last line in that was, I got to reach 7th Street, and that was 74. And by 76, it literally stopped there, because by 76, they had built a wall across accounting scheme across West Road and divided Trenchtown into two, and it became, so everything from 4 to 7 became Rima, and from 8 to 14 became jungle, and the cross at border meant war. So I'm making a case that in the same way how we accept that reparations are due to we who are descendants of the Africans who were enslaved, for all that we have had to endure because of that historical reality. Then there perhaps is a case for reparation to the inner city people, right? For all the ill that have been done to them through the state apparatus that has created that division. 1975 New Year's Eve night, when folks were having countdown for the new year in nice places uptown, my family was trying to survive because our house was firebombed on New Year's Eve 75, and we had to move out by dawn 76 because the youth who I grew up with were now paid to burn down the house because they were now having a purge, right, to create this division, Rima and jungle, right? Who tells those stories? Who tell the stories of people like Ras Diley? Who will tell the story of people like Curly Locks? Curly Locks was a Don in Trenchtown who slim, Indian, high-pitched voice, unassuming, handsome, soft-spoken, don't look like any ragamuffin, but he wielded power. And when Curly Locks said, I must clean up now, it's tidy up, he would walk around and check if us that are being kept tidy and things. Who tells those stories? And those stories, if those stories get told, how will we have a different vision of this place that is seen as the ghetto? So I'm very interested in how the inner cities gets represented and who gets to tell the stories of our people, who gets to represent us on the world stage, who gets to provide access to Trenchtown to like a Beyonce and a Jay-Z, and how does the community get to benefit from that? And how the symbols that we have created for ourselves become read outside of the inner city. When a man yell up with a gun salute and it is seen as inherently violent, how the same thing is not said when we do government official gun salutes to honor heroes. But if I use them finger and go blam blam, it is seen as crude and rough and violent. How do we tell these stories? So that is that's what I really am interested in. The number of untold stories that reside in Trenchtown that are yet untold, and if told by the people, because that's the key thing. If we get to tell our own stories, then, and that's why I'm really interested in documenting, and I have thousands, millions of kilobytes of interviews with people who will tell you that Trenchtown was this nice, wonderful place. Why so bad now? To a person, they say, blame the politicians, blame the politicians who mash it up, right? Those are some of the untold stories. I sat on a sidewalk and hear a nice uptown gentleman tell youth and youth, say, man after dead, the other man can live. And they create a division among the people. Those are among the untold stories. And that's where I want us to look at how do we repay the people who have suffered, whose stories are stories of trials, right? Who carve out triumph out of this existence of trials when it invariably comes from the external elements outside the community. How's my time?
Thank you so much, Blacko.
Yeah.
Their time was perfect.
Okay.
So there are symbols and there are symbols and there are ghettos and there are ghettos. In fact,
yes.
The ones in Jamaica are indeed punching above their proverbial weight category. And there are many untold stories. And I want to say that, there's nothing more for me to add. The fact is that the case study in contradiction is left to be done by you, Blacko. And we await the day when we receive that thesis.
Yes.
So let me introduce to you now our next speaker, Dr. Yannick Hume. She's going to speak to us on imaging the sacred, vernacular symbols of spiritual presence and power. And she is a multifaceted scholar, priestess, dancer, choreographer, with extensive research expertise and specialization across the Americas and the African diaspora. As a tenured academic from the Caribbean with extensive regional and international experience, she has secured expertise and contribution to the Caribbean intellectual tradition, operating from disciplines such as cultural anthropology, cultural studies, and performance studies. Her research interests and teaching interests include religious and performance cultures of the African diaspora, Caribbean thought, popular culture, migration, and diasporic identities. She is multilingual, and her fieldwork experience in the sacred arts and African diaspora performance expressions are centered in the Caribbean and Latin America, especially Cuba, Haiti, Jamaica, Suriname, Brazil, and Colombia. There is so much more that I could say about her. She is a published academic, and she is a recipient of a number of grants, including from the Ford Foundation and Wenegren Foundation for Anthropological Research. Yannick, we are pleased to have you with us and look forward to your presentation.
Hello, good evening. Thank you all. Thank you for this incredible occasion to join in company with you and to share a bit of my work into the sacred, and to, it's wonderful to see the kind of trajectory of thought that has been part of the conversation so far, and to continue that line of inquiry in terms of unearthing, excavating, and bringing to presence some more of the more marginal or invisible symbols, or those that we seldom spend time pondering. Today, I've shifted the title a little bit, just slightly, as opposed to imaging. I've used envisioning the sacred now, and I'll share the screen just now. But the idea of how do we begin to understand the diverse religiosity of the Caribbean, and specifically of Jamaica, and what are the symbols, the vernacular symbols, that have come to represent this rather wide and diverse world. And it's interesting that on this occasion of the birth of His Imperial Majesty, that I am opting to shift the gaze a little bit from the normative patriarchal dominance of imaging religious power and presence and sacrality to women who have really been at the center of a lot of what we would call our indigenous, our folk, and our Afro-Caribbean sacred expressions. And so in envisioning, I want to begin to look at what are some of the symbols that are often not rendered visible because not all eyes could see them, because they're not meant to be decoded by those who, they're not meant to be decoded by those who don't have the religious knowledge to see, yeah? When I was thinking about putting together this presentation, I went immediately to that kind of almost gut reaction of saying, okay, what are these symbols in terms of religion in Jamaica and so forth? And I went to Bedwood and Capo and Garvey, and you could kind of trace that very strong nationalist and patriarchal symbology that surrounds what Jamaican strength, nationhood, heroism, and religion looks like. And especially when we're looking at a kind of Afro-Christian or Judeo-Christian traditions that are cloaked within an Africanity, even though still remain, the images that come to us still remains those that are part of a wider masculine aesthetic, right? Whether it is in the imaging of the robe that we find in, from the early days of Bedwardism, the robe that is used, the robe that is used by Capo, and when we trace that to Bobo Shanti robes as well, and the robes that are used within Rastafari, when we look at the staff that is used either in revivalism or revival rather, and what we've seen Rastafari as the staff, the baston. And I wanted to see and begin to look through what are some of the other things that we use in our traditions. And oftentimes when we think about the realm of the sacred in Jamaica, it's often these objects that we might not deem otherwise sacred. But when they're placed together in unison with other objects, and in the context of a specificity of a particular religious observation or spiritual observation, they get imbued with the sacred. And so a bottle no longer becomes a bottle, or a kitchen bitch no longer becomes just a flame in a tin. It references something else, or a glass of water on someone's head no longer is just a glass of water. So I want to share my screen, hopefully, yes, and begin to explore some of what I'm speaking of specifically through the images. And are you seeing that okay? Yeah.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So I opened with two revered and deceased queen mothers, mother queens, those women who were divinely ordained to rule within the system of Kumina, the religious system of Kumina. And if you look closely on their heads, you will see objects that are quotidian in their use and may be seen as something quite odd to have on the head, but what it represents in terms of their ability to balance divine power. And my interest in engaging Kumina primarily in my discussion this evening is to emphasize that even with the very strong masculinist aesthetic that dominates some of the national symbols around Jamaica's religious radicalism and spiritual power and presence, you also had this very strong divine feminine presence that balanced out this otherwise strong masculinist presence. You had this other energy that also held the bottom, and some might say held the top as well. You have the late Miss Queenie, Imogene Kennedy, and Mother Bird on the left, on the white. And Mother Bernice, I believe Miss Queenie would have passed in 1998, if I'm not mistaken. And Mother Bernice would have transitioned in 2014. Both of these women, Bantu women, descendants, Congo women, Bakongo women, who were the repositories of Congo knowledge and tradition, as in most of the traditions of the clans of Kumina families found in St. Thomas and extending into St. Catherine and parts of Portland. These women held the mysteries, the memories, and the practice, as Mother Bernice would say, in our belly bottom, and also in their embodied engagement with the sacred. And water and fire become two main elements, symbols of which they did the most impressive work within the repertoire of their divine sciences. Congo people know that water is the first, the last, and the most efficacious medicine. It is the way in which the realm of the invisible becomes visible. And it's the way in which those who have transitioned from this earthly plane and this realm of material existence make their transition across what is known as the Kalunga line to the other side of existence. And what you have in this stature of Miss Queenie is her balancing effortlessly, something she did not just for posing for photographs, but in the midst of practice, in the midst of her service and serving the divine ancestral energies of the Kumina pantheon. You find her balancing this water that captures all of these memories because we know the ocean was the first cemetery, and it was the first spaces of which the contact between the continent and the Americas was able to be established. And in her movement, in the circular movements of the dance, of which we wrongly reduced Kumina to, but in the circular movement of the structure of the ritual itself, water is one of the consistent elements. And it is to be balanced and used and manipulated with care. And at the same level, we also have the kitchen bitch, the tin with the kerosene, filled with kerosene, and the wick, and that light. Because where there is water, there must also be light, in order to lead our ancestral kin out of the darkness, lead the spirits who are elevating, who are entering a realm of elevation to be seen, and for us mortal beings to also see them. And so we have with Mother Bernice balancing this light, and she's bound, as you see around her waist. She was known to tie or bind her waist fully, because among the Congo people, it is at the site of the umbilical cord that we find the sacred Yawa, which I'll get into. It is the site, the space of which we connect our human materiality with our celestial spirituality, where the two realms of existence, the living and the dead, come together at the seat of our navel. And so that is one of the most powerful sites of the body, a symbol of divine power and strength, but also it's one of the most vulnerable sites of the body as well. And for the Kumina people, it is a site of which is wrapped and tied and bound, so that the energies remain seated and grounded in the center of the officiant, the center of the body generally of a woman. What we often see within this is a composition of images that were taken from a 2005 exhibition, if I'm not mistaken, at the Ethnographic Museum of the Institute of Jamaica, of which I was co-curator of, working there at the time. And there are some images that might come to mind that we could relate to as symbols of the sacred, of spirituality, of religion, of presence, of power. We have this chalice. I believe it's a 1680 something chalice that is in the collection. We have, that might be the most obvious, and what I think the majority of the Jamaican public may go to as a symbol of a particular religious terrain of Jamaica. But when we look at the composition of these other images, and if we had time for a quiz, it would be interesting to see what people would be able to define and see, and be able to and declare as being a symbol that represents spirit and that represents power. One might be, there are three very strong revival imagery that we find here. We have, that of the baptism in living water. But one of the symbols that were part of the enslaved past, and something that if you drive around certain parts of Jamaica, and most notably St. Elizabeth and St. Anne, you would come across the flags that help to demarcate sacred space. In an earlier period, these same flags, when I say earlier, in a period of enslavement, these flags would demarcate spaces of healing centers known as barnyards, on bamboo sticks with white or red flags with a cross. Here it's symbolizing a revival center, this one particularly here in Wattstown. But you have these images that when the enslaved were working in the fields and moving or traversing across plantations or working their own grounds, to be able to know that the space over yonder is a space they could go for healing, a space that was a center of the highest of sciences, which we like to call, in a diminutive way, obia, but a space of the highest divine sciences for healing. When they saw that flag, they knew that this flag, this site would be a site that they could go to for healing. And this symbol became a very powerful symbol to identify a space where a kind of religious reckoning could happen, a recognition of a memory of something past, but also the very real reality of having a site where they could go and be bathed and receive information through mediums, and also to be given herbs of which they could take, either ingest or used on their bodies to do the kind of curative therapeutic work that we tend not to assign to obia, which is one of its main engines. And also to other African-derived practices that have at their heart and at their center the demand, the kind of thrust of curing, the therapeutic and curative power of the divine sciences is what is encapsulated in some of the symbols here assigned to this flag. And those who are able to decode the colors of the flags will know what kind of work happens in such a space. In the middle, the most prominent image is that of a table. And for those who observed the traditional mourning practices still very rich in Jamaica, coming from a line of grave diggers who understood the power of ensuring that one's journey home was well orchestrated. They knew that certain things had to be in the presence of the home, including your Book of Sankis. Some may include an Old Testament. But with these books, these important texts, were also items that we would find in our kitchen cupboard. Salt, sugar, lime, white rum, sugar and water, plain water. So the table was incomplete if you didn't have these items also present in order to shepherd whatever energies through the space, spiritual energies through the space. We all know Duppy don't like salt, and you call sweet ones with sugar. You make a sweetie longo to call the Bantu spirits to join you. And these things, you use lime for cut bad energy. Somebody come in with a crosses and you use the lime to cut through it. Underneath the table will be 2 machetes, 2 cutlass cross to cut the energies. So those who are able to decode these things would see that the place well aligned, to see that you can't just come in and romp with the people there, because the place is anchored in with something stronger. It's anchored because it's using these elements and unifying the space to bring a certain energy to the particular space. We have seals within revival, seals where you have a combination. Seals could be seen as these spaces of concentrated, consecrated energies that help to focus the divine power of a particular moment. Here you would have, just to the right of the table, with different stones in an enamel basin with medicinal herbs around it. And depending on where it's placed and how it's used, we can understand what is the presence it's trying to invoke or ward off. Then we have the kumina drum, right? That is unskinned. It's just a shell here. And we have a strong tradition in Conques, St. Elizabeth, of the Jonkunu tradition that's linked to the burial mourning traditions of feasting one's ancestors in the family plot, where the Jonkunu headdress, and Bilby writes on this in a beautiful piece where he goes through kind of the history of Jonkunu in Jamaica from its more sacred understandings. And so we have an image of this headdress that will be disbanded after the ceremony is held. So I spoke about the sacred Yawa, the Congo cosmogram, the idea of having the center of the body and everything that goes around it. And a series of images I want to share with you all puts this in action. It puts this as an embodied, active engagement with the sacred. We have this notion of the 4 moments of the sun, how the sea itself, the Kalunga line, divides the world into 2 parts of the living and the dead. The 2, of course, are not diametrically opposed. They actually are part of a symbiotic relationship. So if we just keep that cosmogram in your head and see, this is Leda Mars's Jessamine Garden, West Kingston, and you could see how even within the context of a revival service, unfortunately you can't see the full scope of the circle, but it's a full circle with all the seals and altars placed on the ground, and the manipulation of sacred objects and the constellation of these quotidian objects, whether it's D&G bottle soft drink, and the combination of the colors of those soft drinks with candles and fruits, and imbuing these spaces with consecrated and concentrated energies of the sacred. We have also in the marking or demarcating of sacred space at the start of a Kumina ceremony, this was on Harbor Road, impromptu altar that was erected, again, a center post where the altar or the seal here functions as the center, and then everything happens around it, the movement that happens. It is demarcated beautifully with honey. So honey is a final kind of what holds, that embraces the energy in the center. And it's things like fruits, bougainvillea that they went out and picked in that moment because they realized a kumna needed to happen, and they needed to demarcate the space that was going to be the center of the action. We have here also this idea of this is an earlier 1968 photo of a kumina, 1968 photo of a kumina held with young people in the center holding that center space, and then the circumference of that center being filled with community members listening and taking part in the presentation. And you have this energy of this notion of the worlds being the world of the living and the world of the dead coexisting and being called upon and pulled upon and apart in a synergistic way. And the idea of death and mourning is very important for a lot of my work, and I'm really excited to see and hear of Honor's work with the murals and the various ways in which we have always found a means to remember and to mourn publicly. And one of our richest traditions that are filled with folk symbology is around death. And you don't have to go far to see it. You just have to drive across Jamaica and you are inundated with these images of the deceased and their final resting place. These are images from family plots in Manchester and Clarendon. And you don't have to go far to see it, right? And where, this one on the left has tombs that go back to the 1860s. It's my family land in Manchester, in Chantilly. And the ways in which we have always created these spaces to anchor and to give visibility and a constant reminder that we come from somewhere and from somebody, that we are, while our existence on this plane may have been ushered in by sea, we anchor the memories of those who've gone on in the land. And we make sure that we see them when we traverse the landscape, that they're always with us, that they're always part of our histories, always part of our memories, always part of the ways in which we conceive ourselves as yadis, right? And I'll close with 2 images of Kumina again, where you have the symbols of the drum being a centerpiece in this to activate these energies, to bring these energies to the center, and movement, and the ways in which this Congo cosmogram activates and animates a lot of our existence, where even for those who may not hold on to a Kumina legacy, you would still see how you have this, the casket could function as a sacred center post of which the mourning, those who are mourning, the living who are mourning, can dance around in that divine circle, that ushers us back to the beginning and also propels us into our future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yannick. If we were never aware, there are symbols for invocation, protection, communication, travel, honor, and veneration. These are the people's symbols. And I like the fact that you began with honoring the feminine energies through spiritual leaders of Kumina and other traditions. And there are symbols, even though we know dominantly we have masculine symbols, that these feminine energies and spiritual leaders can be contrasted with. But you found for us and located the balance with which these feminine energies and symbols function with masculine symbols as well. Mm-hmm. So the realm of the sacred in Jamaica, very important, very, very important. And I really want to thank you for that presentation. Our next speaker is Dahlia Harris. Speaking about Miss Lou's method from folklore to mass media, back to our focus, right squarely, or focus on the people's symbols. Dahlia Harris is CEO of DMH Productions Limited. I call her a polymath. She has steadily made her mark as a writer, actress, producer, director, mounting several award-winning and critically acclaimed theatrical and television productions. Among them is Jamaica's #1 television drama, Ring Games. Dahlia has been a media practitioner for over 25 years, working in print, radio, television, and we wonder, well, when do you sleep, Dahlia? She's currently a television host on Smile Jamaica, It's Morning Time, and also radio program, 2 Live Crew on Radio Jamaica 94 FM. She's a first-class honors graduate from our very own University of the West Indies with a double major in English and Media and Communications. I want to welcome you, Dahlia, and ask you now to make your presentation.
Thank you very much, Sonia. First of all, it's a pleasure for me to be here, and this evening as we talk about national symbols, I want to define from my perspective, they say national symbols intend to unite people by creating visual, verbal, or iconic representations of the national people, their values, their goals, or their history. The symbols are supposed to be designed to be inclusive and representative of all the people of the national community. So when we talk about folklore and folk language, folklore is defined as the traditional beliefs, customs, and stories of a community passed through the generations by word of mouth. So what better way to unite a people or to represent their goals or values but through folklore? Huh? So national language serves as a symbol and expression of the national identity of a country. It's part of a nation and a person's heritage. And it fulfills an important function in that it provides a country with a means of communication among its citizens. And it's essential if the citizens are to develop a common feeling of ethnic solidarity and a sense of national purpose. So ideally, it should be the preferred source of communication at every level. But everyone knows when we talk about language, it becomes a very sensitive issue. So sociolinguistic history suggests that among its determining factors, a designated language must have prestige over the other rival languages, usually a result of the prestige of its speakers as well as the place where it's spoken. It must be spoken and accepted by the majority of the citizens of the country. So you wonder, when you put prestige and majority, how do we get these two things together? And that happens through firm guidance of government and the aid of mass media. So it also says language must be in possession of great literature. And that's where I want to start. Must be in possession of great literature. So literature is defined mainly as a body or collection of written work, and more restrictively, it refers to writing considered to be an art form or any single writing deemed to have artistic or intellectual value. So in Jamaica, where our heritage rests so much in oral traditions, how do we come to a place where we see the national language as being patois, or as being how we speak generally, if we are saying that it must be something that is a written work? So two of the things I want to do this evening is to look at the ways in which Miss Lou contests the idea of national language being something that's just prestigious or spoken by the elite, and also how she critiques the national symbols themselves. And I want to start with a little history. I mean, I won't go very far, but in terms of radio, you know that we were characterized by a definite British slant. Radio Jamaica, being one of the earliest stations, was owned by a subsidiary of the British Rediffusion Group and was originally broadcast in a BBC-like format. Eventually, they saw an increase in more authentic Jamaican programming, and that would include Miss Lou's Views, of which I'll speak this evening, a series of radio monologues produced by the Honorable from 1965 to 1982. And that's significant. On the heels of independence in 1962, a lot of the national dialogue and conversation, and a lot of what would have been engaging the public in mass media, is this sense of national identity. Who are we as Jamaicans? What are we trying to achieve? What does this motto mean, and our national symbols? And she was a big part of that discussion. So the movement of folk media into the mass media format, and the way it facilitates the movement of community approaches into national discourse, is a significant feature of Miss Lou's Views. When we talk about folk media, Alice Cosseteng says it's communication forms that are familiar to and accepted by common people for the purpose of entertaining, informing, enlightening, instructing, and educating. The ones used in this series include songs, drama, poetry, proverbs, and storytelling. So stories and songs that would normally be shared in specific village gatherings were now accessible to communities nationally. So you would then be a community in St. Catherine, and the ways of sharing your histories and your values would be as a small community amongst yourselves. But with Miss Lou now moving that dialogue into mass media, then it became communities across Jamaica sharing these stories and these ideas and these values. So in reinforcing the voice of the working class, Miss Lou encouraged them to become actively involved in national dialogue regarding issues of relevance to them. So this national language would now no longer be out of the reach of the working class. They were allowed to interact and to contribute effectively, because it provided accessibility to complex civil topics by facilitating the interpretation of the complex issues as they're translated through identifiable words and phrases and folk forms. To take a phrase from Auntie Roche, it can boil down the whole cascas to pot bottom with a few ordinary words. So in Class and Color Debate, which is one of the episodes of the series, she says the educated gentleman them was a bus whole heap of big word about distinction and discrimination and preconceived motion and equality and superiority and all of them highfalutin sounding sinting there. But she explores the issues through phrasing such as somebody clap them guy and a black somebody, them start class them as low class. And plenty somebody no respect no black somebody at first sight. which aptly describes the color hierarchy in Jamaica. At first sight, of course, suggesting that the foremost criterion used to determine a person's class is their skin color. So the judgment of class through color is only adjusted if the subject is found to have high education, or then get big job, or political bacative, or big motor car. And she suggests it's an adjustment that Black Jamaicans struggle to achieve. So who can't afford big motor car, they pan a strain them pocket for buy big motor car for give themselves class elevation. The words can and strain, of course, emphasizing the difficulty of their attempts. So the realities of colorism and its effect on behavior become more explicit to the audience through the use of their nation language, which is patois. Part of the accessibility also includes the addition of the voice of the ordinary man to national dialogue. So characters are drawn from all classes and social hierarchies. So she breaks down levels of prejudice and barriers to acceptance through parasocial or pseudo relationships. And the language contributes to this process. For as the language of the working class, it helps to guide audience perceptions of characters, situations, and of themselves. So audience can readily identify with messengers and characters through naming. So instead of a proper noun, she uses a number of determinants, which is a folk tradition in the Caribbean, not just in Jamaica. So she's describing people based on their occupation, their characteristics, their personality, their lifestyle, social standing, or their title is used to identify the social actors in the program. So characters are described as the curmudgeon gal, the fool gal, and lay down. And when you hear lay down, you can imagine all he does all day is just lay down doing nothing. She said lay down is a no worker. So again, this is in keeping with the Jamaican tradition of using the language to rename and to nickname. The use of a distinct trait about an individual reflected in a title. So similarly, they're able to understand the context when social actors are defined by words such as big, in big and highfalutin, I'm have a big job, or low class. So audiences who are already appreciative of this form of discursive construction are able to understand the context of the names as they're described in their own language and may apply the desired meaning. So the levels of interaction and discourse also become subverted in the way she uses language, as listeners are able to voice their opinions in a manner which ordinarily would not be facilitated. So class and color debate, for instance, the big highfalutin people debating at the church hall suggests that the debate about class and color is restricted to formal discourse. Academics are the ones who are talking about it in church halls. And this type of formal, prestigious discourse is often what is most respected and recognized as valid, though the issue is being discussed in everyday interaction amongst ordinary Jamaicans. So, but because the interaction is in an informal mode, it's really recognized for its importance. So she inserts that interaction through the inclusion of numerous characters by broadening the perspective of the issue, and also just in the way the language is used and the stories that she tells. So there's a story of her going to an office and the young man sees her, so she asks to speak to the manager. But because I'm looking at her, he said, manager can't speak to somebody like you. But then when the manager comes, he says, wait, it looked like she high. And so just the way in which the language describes what takes place breaks down the issue from being just a macro issue to a micro issue and how it affects people every day. So she also uses it, as I say, to critique the national symbols, and I'm going to show you how she does it with the coat of arms. So, you know, the Jamaican national motto, out of many one people, is represented on the coat of arms. It shows a male and female member of the Taino tribe standing on either side of a shield, which bears a red cross with 5 golden pineapples. The crest shows a Jamaican crocodile mounted on the royal helmet of the British monarchy and mantling. The existing coat of arms was granted to Jamaica in 1661 and was partially revised in 1957. So in this episode, she goes to the community and through their own language, allows them to give their own impressions of the coat of arms. And I'll read it for you. It says, one big cascas broke out in an anti-roach yard about coat of arms changing, you see? The girl dim said that she gonna draw one big pot full of rice and peas and send it go a coat of arms competition. And she must win the competition. For from she born, she hear her grandmother praise rice and peas as Jamaica coat of arms. And she don't know what make them want come change it now. The woman them call much is suck her teeth and holler, ignorancy. And the rice and peas them want to change. And the rightful coat of arms where they pan all we money them and we passport them and we stamp them. And did a little girl pimp holler, and we police uniform button them, and we soldier uniform button them, and we school book them. Please note where those national symbols are. And same time, all the picnic them in the yard start jump up and clap them and holler, change it or not change it? Not change it, then yes, I change it. And a bapsical of arms. And you watch it stamp her foot and get out. Uno stop it. Have manners and respect. We coat of arms not change it, so not take no liberty with it. Man not dead, no call him duppy. For over 300 years, that coat of arms depend represent Jamaica all over the world. It served long and good and distantly. And the Arawak man and woman pan with coat of arms was the first Jamaicans that inherit the land. They miss with right to represent you upon the coat of arms. Kunsi brother, we the all roots, mother roots. But Tata one stump jam him stick a ground and get out. No more Arawak no there Jamaica, then dead out. So me no want no back a time coat of arms. We have to change it. Auntie Roshi theater here upon Tata and say, then you go change the name of your country, Tata. The name Jamaica come from Arawak language, you know. So you go change Jamaica to Bugo Yaga. Tata make up him face and grind him teeth and say, now make a rude to you today, you hear Miss Rochi? What about with African heritage and we black somebody them what fight for independence? What about change to them? And the conversation goes on and on. Miss Lou then places both levels of interaction in a single discourse. So through mass media, she places the nation language and the prestigious language in a single space, the formal and the informal, underscoring the value of both levels to national dialogue. The programs also offer that government uses the media to address the people. So through free education, say listener, only did read the big headline in a newspaper yesterday where say education to be free. Last missus, my auntie Rochi, she jumped for giant Allah, time never too long for Barnabas grow a bean. Now in the 1960s, one of the reasons they thought radio was more relevant than print media was because they thought less people could read, and so listening would be a better means. So when the government addresses the people through newspaper, that in itself tells you that some of the citizens are excluded from this national dialogue. So Miss Lou uses songs and rhymes to bring out the importance of the things that government has said to the people. I'll give you an example. I see Dr. Dyer. Me full up my purse with money, them teeth it away from me. Me full up my belly with food, and as me sneeze, me feel hungry. Me full up my brain with learning, with sense and knowledge grant. Me feel relief, not a thief can thief me education. So really, the rhyming and the songs coax the audience into not just listening to dialogue, but tells them that as audience, you have to participate through your own language. So I'll wrap up because I know we're all short on time, but Stuart Hall offers that linguistically generated meanings help set the rules, norms, and conventions by which social life is ordered and governed. Hence, language is not just passive, but it actually helps to shape society, how we see ourselves, how we interact with others, and how we conform to social rules and norms. So language as a national symbol effectively has to represent the people and has to be something that the people can access. Those are my 15 minutes.
Thank you very, very much, Delia. Oh my gosh, the brilliance of the subversion in Miss Lou's work was way before its time, but it is time to really place Miss Lou's work in perspective. And I'm really so happy that you've been doing this work to remind us of the role of national symbols, the role of folk traditions, and the role of language in particular through the enormous work of Miss Lou and the many characters that she embodied. So I want to thank you for that. Keep doing what you're doing. Our final, but by no means least, the speaker, Dr. Jake Homayak, speaking to us quite in honor of the 128th Earth Strong of His Imperial Majesty. He's talking today about Hail Rastafari, contending symbols of nationhood in the Jamaican post-colony. But let me say a few words about Jake Homayak. He is a cultural anthropologist who received his doctorate from Brandeis University in 1985, recently retired following a 34-year career in the Department of Anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution. Jake began fieldwork in Jamaica in 1980 among members of the House of Nyabingi and has had a sustained relationship with the Rastafari community since that time. In 1988, 89, and 91, he assisted delegations of Rastafari elders to travel to the United States to participate in forums and programs designed to educate the public about the livity and spirituality of Rastafari. Rastafari, of course, remains one of the important symbols of the people of Jamaica. And in 2007, he took this very seriously and curated the exhibition Discovering Rastafari 2007 to 2011 in the African Voices Hall of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. He is the author of various publications, many articles, and co-author of the forthcoming book, Enter the Lion, The State Visit of Emperor Haile Selassie to the Caribbean, 1966, which is forthcoming. Jake, nobody else could have taken your place on this forum to speak to us on this matter. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Sonia. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to be here on the 128th Earth Strong of His Imperial Majesty. Just let me hail up my brethren and sistren. Yes, blessings on this day to one and all. So, you know, when I evolved the title for this, Hail Rastafari, contending symbols of nationhood in the Jamaican post-colony, I wasn't thinking about Jamaica, the Rastafari Jamaican brethren and sistren. I was thinking about His Imperial Majesty, Rastafari, King Rastafari. And what I argued in this, the kind of précis of the argument here is that through the work of the Rastafari movement, even during the colonial period, that Rastafari has been a presence in Jamaica from that very time. And that the visit of His Majesty to Jamaica in 1966 was a profoundly transformative moment for not only the Rastafari community and movement, but for the Jamaican people. And that the aftermath, the energies that were released by that visit were such that it led ultimately to what we think of today as the blackening of Jamaica. It also released the artistic talents of Rastafari brethren and sistren such that the presence of the emperor is now seen everywhere in Jamaica. So I do have a PowerPoint, but I have to say I've gone through this several times since this afternoon, and I in fact know that I won't get through this in time if I attempt to hit all the, to go through the whole thing. Where's my little button over here that it's kind of kind of jammed up where I actually launched this thing. No, that's not it. In any event, I can't do it that way. No, come on.
Perhaps just select each slide on the left.
It won't, okay, that does it. That does it. So I'm actually going to jump over some of these early slides here, because these were speaking to the fact that the quote unquote presence that His Majesty has had in Jamaica all the way from the early 1930s in the colonial period come from the emergence of a Rastafari visual culture that focused on collecting, displaying, circulating, and interpreting images of His Majesty. Those images became surrogates for His Majesty. The picture you're looking at here are the postcard-size images distributed by Leonard Howell, which ultimately were talked much about at his trial for sedition. Here is a photograph, 1953, taken by George Simpson of another of Howell's contemporaries, Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert, in Jonestown, in his yard, in which Hibbert makes his body a canvas to identify with His Majesty. And this has been a practice that we've seen over the years with Rastafari. The photo on the right, of course, is the National Geographic photo. Even the Gleaner participated in this visual culture in a January 1936 article about His Majesty seated, with a picture of him seated on his white charger. The article is penned, according to the paper, by someone who knew him, suggesting it might have actually been penned by an Ethiopian, but it laid out his statesmanship, his progressive attitudes, and the challenges that he would face in maintaining the sovereignty of Ethiopia. And of course, on the left, the Voice of Ethiopia, which was the Ethiopian World Federation's paper that circulated at the same time. By 1937 or 38, they're actually locals in Jamaica. This page on the left is a page from the scrapbook, the scrapbook of a Jamaican Rastafari known only as Brother John, who collected papers from England, Ireland, and the United States covering the Italo-Ethiopian War. I'm not going to dwell too much on these because, as I said, I'll never get through them. Perhaps if there was one context in which these images of His Majesty had a profound effect, was in the street meetings, in the Rastafari street meetings that probably began sometime around the mid-1930s and lasted into the mid-1950s. And here again is a photograph by George Simpson taken in Trenchtown. And we see the photograph of His Majesty standing on the unexploded Italian bomb, a coronation picture in the background. We actually know the name of this brother here, Brother Downer, who had a yard in Trenchtown. But I really want to shift to talking about the impact of the visit of His Majesty, and because it's there that the major impact of the emperor as a symbol in Jamaican nationhood is made. And what I would say is, thinking about what Rex Nettleford said about the visit, pointing out that the enthusiastic reception that was given to the emperor was such that it only rightly belonged to someone, a Jamaican leader, who would normally be considered the embodiment of Jamaican nationalism. It was shortly after that a member of the Jamaican Parliament, Ken Hill, I believe, actually made a motion to replace the Queen of England with Haile Selassie as the formal head of state. And all of this kind of spoke to the fact that the visit of the emperor cut against all the ways in which the British colonial state had told Jamaicans, had told Black people, not only in Jamaica, but of course elsewhere, that there was nothing of value in Africa. There was nothing of value in the African heritage, and the African continent had nothing to offer for the future of their society. Much has been made about the fact that the impact that the emperor had on the Jamaican people devolved from his royal bearing, his dignity, and the calm demeanor with which he enacted the role of emperor before them as he spent 3.5 days in Jamaica. But I would submit, while there's clearly something to that, I would submit to you that there was a kind of spiritual and even cultural alchemy at work that made that impact something greater, that actually constituted a break with the ordinary reality. It wasn't only the dismissal of the formal state honoring at Palisados, but it broke with the ordinary reality and was a portent of things to come. And that was the virtually mythic way in which events at Palisados unfolded. Now, in the book that you mentioned, Enter the Lion, which is about the state visit of His Majesty to the Caribbean, the major part of that book is, in fact, focused on Jamaica. We have 55 testimonies in the book. And just for planing off the details of individual testimonies, the kinds of formulaic things that are remembered of that moment at Palisados go like this. Routinely, it's recalled that a flock of white doves burst through the clouds as if to herald the celestial arrival of the royal aircraft. The abrupt cessation of thunder, lightning, and torrents of rain that had broken a recent drought as his plane landed. The expansive array of red, gold, and green banners, placards, and flags that waved in motion to the sounds of drum, as well as palm leaves that were reminiscent of Christ's entry into Jerusalem. And of course, there was the column of brilliant sunlight that came down upon the emperor as he stepped out onto the gangway of the plane and then spread across the crowd, drying them. And finally, the stone that the builder refused. It was Ras Mortimer Plano of the Dungle who was summoned to embark the emperor from his plane and move him from this chaos. So I argue what happened in the rest of the visit was as much, if not more, a rite of passage, of profound transformation for the Rastafari movement, for the people of the movement, as well as the Jamaican people. The way in which, the energy with which that day is remembered and the questions that were later posed, the kind of statements that His Majesty made, went to fundamental questions about identity. They were involved in the questions of identity. Who are you? What is your place in the world? Where do you come from? What is your ultimate destiny and future? All of this essentially was addressed by His Majesty in the following days. Now let me jump to that. When His Majesty first publicly spoke, he did so at National Stadium, and he said that he thanked the Jamaican people for the support that they had given to Ethiopia during the Italian occupation. He said he knew that Jamaicans of African blood had supported their liberation. He also went on to say that the Ethiopian people and the Jamaican people were blood brothers with long relationships. The following day in the reception for the Governor General, he stated that Jamaica is part of Africa. He went on to continually note the history of relations between of positive sentiments between the two countries, and stating again with African blood, wherever there is shared African blood, there is a basis for greater unity. Citing the commonality of interests of countries like Ethiopia and Jamaica as small states, he urged that they raise their voices together in the Council of Nations. And in this sense, he made another signature statement that stands out from his visit to Trinidad or Barbados or Haiti. He said, with respect to the OAU, that commonality of interest is why we have sought to include Jamaica too, that is, in the Organization of African Unity. And then looking forward to the future development, he talked much about education and, of course, laid the cornerstone for the school that is at Payne Avenue today. All of these statements were framed based on his subsequent acts and based on the way the media handled this. All of these statements about blood brotherhood and affinity were framed in relation, I would argue, to the Rastafari. And the pivotal event that took place here that cemented this was the evening of his arrival of his first day, the reception that the Governor General held for him at King's House. The emperor used that occasion to medal 13 Rastafari leaders. After he did that, he commended them, saying, "Continue your works, they're purposeful. Organize and centralize." This particular moment was critical because it happened at King's House, elevating the Rastafari, formerly the marginalized and demeaned semi-citizens of Jamaica, elevating them to the national stage for the first time and putting them in intimate contact with Jamaican elites. He did this in a context affirming his relationship to the Rastafari. That act affirmed his relationship to the Rastafari. It's interesting that the Rastafari were continually persecuted in prior years for actually asserting that relationship. One might say that the king conferred a kind of legitimacy upon the brethren at that point. But as an anthropologist, I think it's more complex than that. Because what he had done, what the whole scenario painted was he had meddled a group of Rastafari leaders who were already peripheral, who were already marginalized, but he had made them more acutely marginal than they were before. He had made them more acutely liminal than they were before. He had exchanged their crosses for crowns, the cross and crown metaphor being one that we find in the multivocal symbolism of dreadlocks. He had crowned them, as it were, and by extension, the entire Rastafari community. Doing this in the context of King's House was significant because it was the last resistant bastion to colonial authority. And this positioned them uniquely, positioned the Rastafari community uniquely, giving them a moral authority from which over the next decade or more to engage with Jamaican society. And we in fact know what the upshot of that was. In fact, that liminal status, that one in which one is in a dangerous position, but also a potentially extremely creative one, released energies that led to reggae music, a complete shift in the politics of Jamaica. We had Hugh Shearer and the leader of the opposition, Michael Manley, going to Ethiopia. Siaga soon following after that. We had the emergence of a new mansion, the 12 tribes of Israel, which in fact reopened the repatriation initiative that had been sidelined at the time of independence, right before independence. We had the arrival of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and we had a new era of the blackening of Jamaica. How am I doing on time, my dear? I'm out of time?
Yes, you can wrap up actually.
Can't be out of time. I'm jumping. I'm completely jumping to the kinds of civic art that we saw effloresce after the visit of His Majesty. Interestingly, here we have His Majesty Garvey, Paul Bogle, Granny Nanny, and King Prempeh, who was in the Ashanti Wars of the late 19th century. The commonality between Black liberators in Jamaica and African liberators being part of the whole Pan-African theme. Later on, we see wall murals like this that suggest the emperor's attitude toward gender relations and the movement in which the direction has gone in more recent years. These kinds of wall murals basically were such that they transformed humble ghetto yards into temples and sites for spiritual ascension. They transformed shops and Rastafari businesses into culture, sites of cultural activity. This is the Rastafari Centralization Organization. At Racecourse, the Arts by Ras Wittedred. Sadly, to honors talk, many of these murals are now gone or faded. The production of Rastafari banners is another aspect of this. I'm going to close with this slide. This is a slide from my brethren Jelani Naya in Pembroke Hall around 2011. In discussing the nature of Rastafari as a multivocal symbol, the emperor is in play and he's in no fixed relationship to any reference, Jamaican or Pan-African or whatever. This slide here reminds me of the entire message of the emperor's visit. Notice that Usain Bolt, Miss Lou, and Bob are backgrounded by the national flag. But look at His Majesty as an adjunct symbol here. I first looked at this and thought it was fire in the background, but no, it's fluid, it's blood. It is the blood, it is the African blood that joins these diasporic Africans with him as the metonym of Africa itself, as representing all of Africa. There's multiple ways in which we might interpret this. But as I'm out of time now, I'll leave the larger discussion about His Majesty as a multivocal symbol, the complexities of his symbolism. I just want to say one more thing about the complexity of his symbolic. In recent years, and by recent years in the last 10, 15 years, it's increasingly the case that in pointing to a picture or photograph of the emperor, a brethren or sister might say to you, when you see His Majesty, what do you see? Do you see a black man? Do you see a brown man? Do you see a white man? No, you see every man. In some sense, that ambiguity is much like Jamaica itself, a black nation in the vernacular conception, a multiracial nation by its formal declaration, but it's a nation that is sending a message of one love to the entire world. So I can do no better than leave you with the words of His Majesty at a moment when perhaps we are actually looking at a global reckoning on issues of racial justice and equality. I leave you with his words. We must become something that our education and experience has ill prepared us for. We must become more courageous, greater in spirit, broader in vision. We must become members of a new race, overcoming petty prejudice and owing our allegiance not to nations, but to the community of our fellow man. Hail Rastafari.
Thank you so much, Jake, for locating Rastafari. Rastafari. His Imperial Majesty, a symbol of Jamaican nationhood. And there are so many ways in which we know this. This is evidence in the circulation of images in a developed visual culture, as you've told us. Images which function as surrogates. In fact, I would like to say as ventriloquisms of Rastafari. And you tell us Rastafari is a multivocal symbol. So the people's symbols, colleagues, are varied and tell different stories from the dominant colonial narrative. And I'm now left to ask you, our presenters, in 1 minute, what do you want to leave with the audience? Your final words, your closing remarks. What do you want to say about the people's symbols and how varied, how much they tell us different stories from the dominant colonial narratives that have been left with us, even in this post-colonial time? And you can go in any order that you so feel. And I want to just remind those who are joining us on Facebook, those who are here with us on Zoom, if you have a burning question, send it to the host. You can do that in the chat, and I will make your question. If it's a burning question, I will make it known. So over to our speakers with their final comments or remarks. I also want to remind us, as we are getting our final remarks ready, we can show the slides from Honor, and maybe now is a good time, as we say our closing remarks, our technical team will allow the sharing of those slides. Perhaps we take them as we go out with some music after we take our closing remarks. Yannick, any closing remarks? Bert?
I would just say that the power of our symbols are in the power of which we're able to decode them. And this is oftentimes animated by an ability to discern. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. The discerning ones will be able to see, smell, taste, even when sometimes what is in front of the eye is invisible. Closing remarks, Blacko? I'm calling on you in any particular order. In no particular order, I should say. Anyone?
I would offer a remark that comes from the other hat I've worn over many years at the Smithsonian, which is directing an archive. And so, in addition to discernment, there's remembrance. And this kind of goes with Honor Ford Smith's remarks. Remembering these symbols and remembering the stories and narratives that are associated with them. It's quite so clear to me, having worked on this book about testimonies associated with the Emperor's visit, that we haven't even scratched the surface. There is so much more there, and we're at a moment in time when the generation of those who witnessed, many of those who were middle-aged are now gone. Mm-hmm. The heads who were witness were gone long before. But now we're at a point where individuals who were 8, 10 years old, 8, 10, 12 years old, are also, transitioning. So I think there's a duty to document and record these things that are part of the national patrimony. They're part of the intangible cultural history and the narrative history, the orature that tends to be forgotten, as others on this panel have said. So I counsel remembrance and diligence in that area.
Remembrance and diligence. I want to also ask Blacka, perhaps, Honor, perhaps, maybe Honor can give us her closing remarks as we take her images.
Yes. Well, am I muted? Yeah, no.
No, we can hear you.
Okay, first of all, I made a mistake. I want to thank Blacka very much. I didn't big up Blacka because it was Blacka who, there were two people who got me first interested in the murals. The first one was Sharon. She's the partner of, I'm getting old, so my head is gathering water. President's wife, who would not like me to address her thusly, but
Sharon
I want
Chaka.
to thank her very much for Sharon Chaka, thank you. And the other person was Blacka, and Blacka helped me initially, so I want to big them up. I want to also big up all of the painters that I haven't been able to call all their names, but all of the painters whose work provides the basis of this presentation, who are extremely humble people who work for next to nothing and who manage to produce these amazing pieces of work and who have very graciously submitted to the destruction of their work without burning down anything like a police station. I want to end by saying I have a big concern as we think about memory, and it is that when we talk about nation, increasingly we talk about nation not so much as an imagined community or a set of relationships which we have with each other, but more as a thing, as a commodity, as a brand. And it makes me very concerned that this, we have reduced the notion of community to the notion of a brand. And this, I think, has to do with the way in which neoliberalism has kind of taken over the discourse. What I think we need to look at these murals to think about and about the spirituality of women, the women's symbols, and the women's spirituality, which I like to call a sort of spirituality of care. That we think about what kind of alternative world would we like to live in, and what do these particular images and ideas that have been presented here today help us to imagine a world in which we can have equal and sustainable relationships with each other that is not based on this horrific inequality that still exists in Jamaica, and a situation where you can still read off somebody's class and color from their body and how they speak. What kind of alternative would we like to have? And how can we bring back a discussion or bring a discussion of alternatives alongside this ongoing language of branding and commodities and marketing, which seems to have so much constraint the way that we speak to each other and the way that we imagine and reduce our relationship commodity for exchange. So that's what I'd like you that's what I'd like to leave with you. So thank you, Blacka.
All right, so thank you, Anna. I want to quickly leave one last thing. As I'm interested in space and place and the geography of a place like Trenchtown, I wanted to point us to the notion that our space is represented helps to either preserve power or contest power. And I wanted to invite everybody to, in their own time, look on 2 music videos on YouTube. Look on Junior Gang's Welcome to Jamrock and Junior Gang's Living It Up. Both of them draw on Trenchtown, but in different ways. And ask yourself, how is meaning being produced here and how space is being represented here? That's it.
Thank you very much, Blacko. Do we have any remarks from Bert? I wanted to just give everyone an opportunity to close. Dahlia?
Yes, I
yes?
just wanted to say, when we talk about language, you know, the Rastafari principle of word, sound, and power, that there's a power essence being encapsulated in a name or a word, or the things that we say, and the Rastafari contestation of language in the way they modify vocabulary and dialect reinforces the importance of language as a national symbol, and that it's something that more work needs to be done. We honestly can't overlook, and that if we are going to honestly say that language represents people and values, that it's something that must reflect the people and something that people should be able to connect with and access.
So Bert, just want to tell us before Bert comes in that we do have some questions that have been posed to us, and I even if we are not able to answer them in this moment, I want to I feel committed to airing them because they're questions, burning questions or comments on the part of our audience members. And so Bert, you can come in at any time.
Yes, I just want to say, as we talk about symbols that represent us and symbols that betray us. And the greatest betrayal of us is the symbol of the Queen of England remaining at the pinnacle of the Constitution and remaining owners of crown lands. And that must go before we can now put in its place the new symbols. We need to take her down. Thank you.
And so say all of us. I really believe that we should. There is no place for the Queen in Jamaica at this time. I want to just voice some of the comments and questions, even if we're not able to respond, but you can let me know, speakers, if you do want to. One question from Dre: have there been any symbols that have been elevated to the status of nationally symbolic, or that of the nationally symbolic in post-independent Jamaica? In other words, he says, are national symbols dynamic in that new generations get to expand the list of what is considered such? And Bert, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in my own lifetime, I was born in 1970. I haven't seen any symbols become added to the list of national symbols in post-independent Jamaica. And we can almost say the same thing about our national heroes, that there are ways in which the new generation, the things that represent us as people of Jamaica, it's not dynamic at all. The committees of government that are supposed to be meeting to make decisions about these things are not meeting. And so there's a way in which you could assume it is not a dynamic arrangement at all. And we want to correct those things. We also have a question from Hugh. How are we now listening to the voice of every man, every woman, where their voices are heard and used to create change? He says the work of the ordinary Jamaican in the construction of what we know to be our identity has formed center stage in these wonderful presentations. But how are we now listening to the voice of the ordinary man, the ordinary woman? Where are their voices being heard and used to create change? You can think on that, presenters. And I want us to really consider that what we've shared here this afternoon with our friends and colleagues and listeners far and wide on Facebook and with us on Zoom is really an excavation of the conversation, a continuing conversation about independence, a conversation about freedom, a conversation about defining our own identity and our spaces of being. That indeed and in fact, when we think about Jamaica as an independent country since 1962, there are ways in which we are not independent. There are ways in which we must excise that word from our vocabulary when we begin to think about Jamaica, because there are so many ways in which we are not independent. We remain people striving to complete the process of emancipation in the way that Erna Broadbent reminded us. So I want to close by thanking the team at the ICS for rising to the call of duty every time. I want to thank our technical team, Isabel Dennis. I want to thank our coordinators, assistants, the Kadian Williams and Bettine Ross Laws. I want to thank our PR team and thank the coordinator of the event, member of the National Reparations Council, for the vision behind this summer series, Dr. Jelani Nair. This event wouldn't be possible without our speakers, and I want to thank all of you for giving of your time in the second in our summer series of engagements. Audience, listen out for more in the series as we continue to bring you cutting-edge conversations on the ways in which we live and have our being in post-colonial Jamaica. Thank you very much all.